good afternoon everyone, and welcome to the Denali webinar series for March 4th, 2015. Hope everyone can hear me okay and see the screen okay. We should be all logged in and ready to go now, so we'll go ahead and get started. My name is Jeremy Beislein. I am a trainer here at Cougar Mountain Software. I'll be your presenter today for the webinar. And we ask that when you're interacting today, please go ahead and type any questions or comments you have in the chat. We ask that you keep your phone or mics muted during the webinar. And at the end of the webinar, we'll get to your questions with what time we have left. Okay, so today we are going to be talking about landing costs, the freight charges for your inventory when you receive items in the purchase order module. We're going to go over all the settings in purchase order on how to set that up, and then how to actually implement those shipping and freight charges as part of the inventory costs when you are entering your items to be received in the inventory module. This is all handled in the purchase order module in Denali, so this is where we're going to be working today, is in the Denali Purchase Order, which of course integrates to your inventory module along with the other modules as needed. So with that, we will switch over to our purchase order here. All right, so what landing costs are is they're the extra charges that are involved with your inventory items when you receive items. You've got the price of the item that you have to pay your vendors for your items receiving, but then you may have additional costs such as shipping or possibly even sales tax. Those items can be incorporated as part of your inventory costs, and they can also be expensed as part of your cost of goods sold when you sell those items. Denali Purchase Order has a really nice way of handling that for you under what's called landing costs. When you land the items in, it will include those extra charges as part of your cost for your inventory. But just like everything else in Denali, it's very customizable, so there are some initial settings that must be taken care of if you're going to use the landing features in the Purchase Order module. And the first settings that we need to look at are in your module preferences. So under the Generals tab in module preferences, you'll have a section here called landing. Right here, it's very important that you select what it is you want Denali to keep track of to incorporate as part of your inventory costs when you're receiving items. The first option is asking which items on the purchase order do you want to add the landing costs for? Do you want to incorporate those landing costs too? Your options are none. If we say none, that means that no landing features will be enabled in the purchase order module. We won't be using the landing cost features. Basically what that means is you'll be keeping track of any landing costs separately and not incorporating them as part of your inventory value and also part of your cost of goods sold. The next option is inventory. Now, if we select inventory, then it's only going to incorporate the landing costs for inventory items that are on the purchase order. Any items that you're receiving that will be posted to the inventory module, those are the only items that will have the landing costs incorporated. Most of your items in purchase order probably will be inventory, so most of you will probably select inventory and leave it at that. However, purchase order also allows you to add additional line items on the purchase order that are not inventory items. They will just be called what we call direct expense items. If you want the shipping and taxes that are on the invoice from your vendor to also apply those charges to the additional items that are not just the inventory items but the other 9 items, then you would select all lines for items to land. Once you've made your selection of what we're landing, then we're going to select what landing costs we are going to apply to these items. There's 3 different options here. We've got freight, which is your most common. Most of you will be paying freight and shipping charges to have your inventory shipped to you. So that one is going to be very common. The second option is taxes. What that is a sales tax. If your vendor charges you sales tax for your inventory items, then the sales tax can also be incorporated as part of the cost of the item itself. Most retailers and resellers will not have tax because they're exempt from taxes since they charge their customers sales tax and pass that on to the taxing authority in your area. However, if your vendor does charge you sales tax for items you're going to resell or track in inventory, you can include the tax as part of those costs for those items. The third option is discount. Discount actually reduces the cost of your inventory item, but that does allow you to get a more accurate cost for when you receive those items in. If your vendor gives you an early payment discount or any kind of a item discount on the inventory items you're receiving, you can incorporate that discount to help reduce that cost if you want that to be reflected on the cost of the inventory itself. A lot of times we leave that unchecked because the discount is like a special bonus that we reduce our expenses in the end. However, the value of our inventory and cost of goods sold does not reflect the discount, and if you choose to set it that way, you would leave that unchecked. And then for the landing to work, we want to always choose this option here to select line items to land. Make sure that you have that option selected if you're going to use the landing features in the Denali Purchase Order. So that's going to be our landing method. That way you can specifically select which items on the purchase order you want the landing cost to apply to. So make sure that you select line items to land as your landing method. So once we've set those up, then the next thing we need to do in our settings is we need to set up our purchasing and receiving layout screens to include the landing features and the landing options for the Denali Purchase Order screens and the receiving screens. So I've got our first one here is Enter PO. That's a purchasing screen. That's the screen that comes up when we enter a purchase order, basically when we're placing an order for inventory items. Now the options you want to make sure you have selected here is you need to have the freight amount on the header section added to the screen. The freight amount will be how much the freight will be on this order, and that amount will be incorporated as a landing cost if you choose landing. If you don't include this field on your screen, it doesn't give you the option to enter the freight amount, which also in turn doesn't give you the option to incorporate that amount as part of your landing costs. So make sure you include the freight amount. You'll see it over here if it's not included on your screen already on the available fields, and you just select that and click Add, and then it includes it there. Then you can position it where you want that to be on the header section of the purchase order entry screen. And we'll take a look at that once we get to that screen, and I'll show you how that works. On the detail section, we also need to add a couple of fields as well. We need to add the Apply Freight field for the specific items that you're going to be applying the freight amount to. So, for example, if you have a freight charge of, say, $100 for a shipment, and you want to apply that $100 freight to all of your items, then in the detail section you would select the Apply Freight box on all the items that that $100 will be applied to. If that $100 freight is only going to be applied to some items, then the items it does not apply to, you leave the box unchecked, which you will see that when we get to the Enter Purchase Order field. But that field must be there, which you set that up here in the Setup Purchasing Receiving Layout for your Enter Purchase Order layout here. So we must have the Apply Freight. Now if you're also going to incorporate taxes, the sales tax as part of your landing costs, then you also need to include the taxable field as well. All this is a checkbox. The Apply Freight and the taxable, they're just checkbox fields. And if the items are taxable items that you want to incorporate in the landing costs, then you need to check the box as taxable as well. That way the taxes on those items will be included in the landing costs. So once you've set up your Enter screen, we save the information there, then we have to bring up our Receiving screen and put the settings in for that as well. Now on the Receiving screen, the header section doesn't have anything that we need to worry about on landing because that was done on the Enter screen. We have a separate section on the Receiving screen specifically for landing. As you can see there, it's going to be under the Landing tab. And these are the fields we put here. The landed freight is the dollar amount of freight that will be added to the inventory item value as part of the cost of receiving that item. It will be included as the value of that item to post through to your inventory account. In the inventory module, it will update the last cost to include the shipping of those items, and it will also incorporate the value of those inventory items to your inventory account as posted to the general ledger when you receive those items. And that also applies to your sales tax. The tax field is the dollar amount of the sales tax for the entire purchase, the entire shipment. So you would enter the dollar amount of the freight and the dollar amount of the taxes. And if you're using the discount, you would enter the dollar amount of the discount to reduce the cost of those items. That would, these are the fields that you will need to add to the landing section of your receiving window. But you also must add a couple of fields to the details section for each item that is being received. The fields we need are the land item field. This is a checkbox field. This basically says, okay, at the receiving, we want to land this item, which means we're going to include the landing costs for this item to be incorporated and update the last cost. You also can put in your landed unit cost and landed extended cost as part of the receiving screen, so you can see how those costs will be incorporated on that particular line item. So these three fields are going to need to be added to the receiving screen under the detail section. So once we've set up our entering and receiving screen, now we are all set up and ready to start using the landing features in Denali Purchase Order. So the way you would actually use those once everything is set up and ready to go is you go into your Enter Purchase Order screen. We're going to create a new purchase order here. And I actually have one already set up and ready to go for this webinar, so I'll just bring up the one I set up here that I specifically entered for this webinar. So here we have a purchase order that we've got set up and ready to go. When you're entering your purchase order, you put the purchase order date, the expected date, which is today's date because we're going to receive it today. Ship via. Freight type must be either added or collected if we're going to incorporate that as part of the landing cost. Because if we set it to prepaid, then there is no freight. That means prepaid means the freight is 0. And you can see the freight amount now changes to 0 and the field is grayed out. So there will be no landing cost for freight if we set that to prepaid. However, you can still use the taxes on prepaid if you're going to incorporate the sales tax portion as part of your landing costs. But for freight, if we go collected or added, then that opens up the freight field. Now we enter how much is the freight for this shipment going to be. So if I put in $100 there, now this is at the time of ordering, so you put in $100 for your freight, then that tells us, okay, for this shipment, we're going to pay $100 freight. Now, I know the question comes up, well, what if we don't know what the freight is when we're placing the order, which is probably going to be the most likely case. You probably don't know what your freight's going to be. In that case, you can either put in your best guesstimate here, or you can just put in $1. You must put in at least $1 for the dollar amount. There has to be an amount under the freight type. I suppose you could put in a penny. That would work. But if you put in 0, then your apply freight field disappears, which means there will be no landing for freight. So you must put in a dollar amount at the time that you are entering the purchase order so that we can go and select which items we're going to apply the freight for landing. And then you're going to put in your items on the purchase order and check the box to include the freight amount as part of the value of that item when you receive that item. Now, it's okay if you don't know what it is. You can put $1, it's fine, because when we receive the item, we can change that to the actual freight amount. If you do know what it is, though, those amounts will automatically be pre-filled in for you at the time you receive the item, and you don't have to make the changes then. It'll automatically take care of it. So it is better to know what that is, but if you don't, that's okay. We can always change it when we receive the item. So once we put in our freight amount, then we're going to apply that to each item, which means we're going to land the freight amount as part of this item. So it's going to take the total cost of this freight and automatically distribute it evenly among all these items based on the quantity for those items. And it will do that at the receiving transaction. All we're doing here is placing the order, so there is no actual transaction taking place. And if we also want to include the tax amount, we can check the tax box, if applicable. So we'll go ahead and save our purchase order. All right, so we placed our purchase order a week ago. We got that all set up and ready to go. So now, here we are today. The shipment comes in. Here comes UPS with our shipment of this order. So we're receiving our items now. Now, this is where the transaction takes place. This is why it's asking here in purchase order to set up a batch, because we don't currently have a batch open. So now we're going to go ahead and create a new batch. Go into our receiving screen here to receive this order we just placed. Alright, so now the receiving screen, the first thing it asks is which purchase order are we receiving. So we double click on the field and we find our purchase order in the list right here. Alright, so of course here's our receiving date, which is our general ledger receiving date for the inventory. This will also post to the inventory module for these items we're receiving. If we want to put in a description, we can. Monthly webinar. There we go, that works for our transaction description. And if we've completely received this shipment and also have received the invoice along with the shipment, we can go ahead and check the complete box there. That basically will close out this purchase order when we post. It also closes, you notice all these boxes over here for each item is completed as well. So now we enter in how many we received. Well, we ordered 10. Yep, we received 10 of them, so very good. This is our cost. However, we want to include the shipping and taxes, so we need to land this item. So we just check the little box here to land. This is the field I was talking about on the setup, on the receiving side. So we check our box here to land the item. And as you can see, the landed freight automatically fills in $8.13 right here. That's based on the $100 for the total purchase order divided amongst all the quantities here. So we've got a total quantity of, what do we have, 105 items divided by $100, so $8.13 for these 10 because we're landing those items there. And that's what we received. Now we received 20 of this item because since it's completed we received them all. And since we're also, you notice the freight here automatically updates on the invoice, but the landing freight didn't change until we check our box because we're going to land this item. Now the landing freight changes here to tell us what's being landed. What amount of the freight is being incorporated as landing costs is what that's for. And then our last item, we ordered 75 of those. We received 75, and we'll go ahead and check that to land as well. Since everything is received and everything is being landed, now you can see our landed freight equals $100, which was the amount we entered on the original purchase order. Also, the invoice amount for freight is also $100, as you can see here, to our vendor. So we have our landed freight and our invoiced freight. Now, what if the freight amount, well, first of all, what if we didn't know what the freight amount was, and so we just put $1 on our purchase order for freight? What you would see here, if you receive everything, is $1 for landed freight and $1 for the amount actually invoiced. But now that we've got the invoice, we know that's not right. So this is why it gives us the option to change these fields as needed. Maybe the shipping wasn't exactly $100. It was actually $103.85. You can change that here to land the correct amount, and also that's the amount that we're invoiced for this shipment as well. So you can update these amounts manually on the receiving window as needed. It'll just carry, that's why I was saying you have to put at least $1 there, and then on the receiving transaction you can change that here on both the landing amount that you're going to land and also the amount that you're actually invoiced for the freight charges, the shipping charges. And of course you can also do that with the tax. Let's see, 336310 is our total purchase order amount. Maybe the tax on that is about $28.35. That's just a good guesstimate, but you'll actually enter the right amount what the tax is. So now it's incorporating the tax amount as part of the landing costs as well, and then also enter the tax that's on the invoice here. Our invoice number for this shipment, let's throw a number in there, to our vendor, which is Big Sky up here. And then our total invoice amount now comes down to $3,391.45. And you can see the breakdown right here. $32.59.25 is the items we ordered. $28.35 is the tax, if applicable, and $103.85 is our shipping, for a grand total of $33.91.45. But look up here on the receiving screen. We have our actual cost for each item, as you can see here, and you can change that here as needed. If the vendor charged us more than what the last cost was on the inventory. You can change that when you receive those. However, you also notice the landed cost over here. It's not going to let me select it because it's a grayed out. You cannot change these fields because these fields are automatically calculated based on the entries that you put down here. So now you're seeing our unit cost is a little bit higher than our actual cost. And the reason why is because it's including the landing costs. It's including the freight and taxes as part of that inventory value for this item. And it's doing that on all of these items. And then our extended, of course, is unit times quantity. That gives us an extended cost. So that gives us a grand total. And you can see how Denali Purchase Order is distributing these charges under the landed extended costs to each item. So when you save this receiving transaction, you're going to get your warning here if you've got your module preferences to warn you when the price changed. See, the price didn't actually change on the item, but we are applying shipping and taxes to this item now, so therefore the price has changed. That amount will be posted to inventory as the last cost. It will include the landing costs. So if we look at that, it'll show us the increase on those prices, and basically our increase is our landing costs. When this report comes up here, and there it is. See, this was our, before receiving, this was our last cost. After receiving, this is now our last cost, which is a 4.06% increase. Basically, that's our landing costs. So we're paying a 4.06% for this item for landing costs. For this item, it's 3.66%, and for our last item down here, it's also 4.06%, based on the amount that we've ordered and the distribution of the landing costs. So you can also see our sales price profit margin has gone down a little bit because our sales price did not increase, which means we're set to list pricing on these items. List pricing, I'll get it right, on these items, but our cost went up. So therefore, our profit margin has now been decreased, and this tells us exactly the variance of how much our profit margin has been reduced because of the landing costs. Now, if you have your sales price set to markup or margin, the sales price will automatically update to include the landing costs as part of your last cost, and also update your selling price as well. And that's done in the inventory module on the items. Okay, so that is how we add landing costs to our inventory in the purchase order module. That is the process to get that all included. So with that, we'll go ahead and open up the chat here, and I'll bring up our questions, and we'll try to get as many answered as we can. Laura, good question. Why do you not want to choose a landing method of automatic distribution? The situation with that is with automatic distribution, it's supposed to take those landing costs and automatically apply those so you don't have to check the boxes to land those items. The reason we don't want to use that right now is because with the current version of Denali, there is an issue where that isn't working correctly, but with the next version, that issue will be resolved. So yes, that will make it so you don't have to check the boxes to apply freight, apply taxes, and land those items. But right now, for a workaround, we need to select the option to select items to land and check the boxes. And then for automatic, it would work the same as if all the boxes were checked. So we would just basically, I'll just switch back over real quick and show you how that works. By selecting line items to land, if you want all items to be landed, when you're entering your purchase order, just make sure we check all of our boxes for both freight and taxes if you're landing freight and taxes. And then by doing that, it would work the same way as automatic distribution. Just have all boxes checked like we have here. All right, so be sure to stay tuned, and with the next upgrade, be sure to update that, and that issue will be resolved. But yes, that's how automatic distribution will work. Right now, it is a feature that we are correcting. So for now, we'll just use the select items to land. Okay, so another question from Missy. What if we receive the items, but we don't invoice them yet? That is a really good question, Misty. The landing comes in place when you receive the items. So what I would recommend doing, if that's the case, is make sure that if you're going to get the invoice later and you don't know what the landing costs are until you actually receive those items, then you're going to need to wait to enter the receiving transaction until you know what those landing costs are. Because here's what happens. Let me pull up. I'm going to go ahead and clear our current transaction. And we'll reset that here. With Denali Purchase Order, it's designed to receive an invoice, or you can receive only an invoice later, and that works just fine if we bring up our purchase order here. And we're only going to receive the items only. But as you can see, on the receiving transaction, this is where the landing takes place. You would still put in your landing cost down here, or allow the system to automatically calculate it based on what the landing charges for the purchase order was entered in under freight. Get my fingers to work here. There we go. So if we land all items, see, we entered $100 on our purchase order, but we can change that here at the receiving transaction if needed. And we can also put our taxes here. However, this is done at the receiving end. So if you still don't know when you receive the items what those charges are, then you would need to either contact your vendor so that you can get the correct information put in at receiving, or just hold off until you get the invoice and then just receive an invoice at the same time. Because if you invoice only, our landing section disappears because the landing part happens at the receiving. The reason why is because when you're landing your items, that's when the items post to the inventory module. And that's also when the items post to the general ledger as part of your inventory asset account. So those landing costs have to be done at the receiving transaction. The invoicing, all that does is just posts the invoice to accounts payable. That's basically all that does. And then, of course, it'll move the liability from the pending account to the actual accounts payable account in general ledger. But the inventory side of it's already done when you invoice only, because the receiving has already been done. So therefore, you will need to make sure that you know what those landing charges are at the receiving transaction. All right, so let's move on to our next question here. Okay, this is another question by George. How about port fees paid to another vendor? The only way we're going to be able to do that, Denali doesn't have a separate landing item for port fees, so the only way you'd be able to do that is enter that as a direct expense line item on the original purchase order. And you can always update the cost of that item on the receiving transaction as needed. So that wouldn't be the problem with that is it's not going to distribute that charge across your inventory items. What you would want to do in that case is set your items to land to inventory only, and then include that as part of the landing costs on the landing section of the purchase order, but just exclude that. Oh, that's a separate, yeah, and that's a separate line item too. So you would just need to include that as part of your freight landing costs. But then don't include that as part of the freight amount on the invoice line item on the purchase order. To give you an idea of what I mean on that is, that is a good question, George. Very good question. Basically what you would do is, let's see, I need to receive my purchase order here. So let's say we're receiving all of our items here, 10 of these, and we want to land that item, 20 of these, land that item, and 75 of these, and land that item. So now we have our shipping as $100. This is what our vendor, in this case Big Sky, is charging. But then what if we have port fees as well that are say what, $35? You would need to include that here, $135 for freight now. But $100 is only the freight for Big Sky. So when we send this invoice to accounts payable, we're only going to pay $100 to Big Sky, but $135 is what's going to be incorporated as our landing costs here. Then you would need to enter a separate invoice in the accounts payable module for $35 to your port authority vendor. And that would take care of the invoicing of that. That way you can incorporate those extra charges as needed here. Can landing be done in AP? Very good question. In order to land in AP, you just have to include it on the line items for each item on the invoice. Just include whatever the landing costs are as part of the cost of that line item. So it doesn't automatically take care of it for you in AP. Only purchase order has that feature. Okay, is this issue you're referring to where the landing makes your general ledger out of balance? That's a question from Laura. No, what this is, I believe what you're talking about there is the automatic distribution issue. No, the issue where we had the landing cost throwing the GL out of balance, that should have been resolved. So that's no longer an issue. What it is the automatic distribution is basically in effect just not working right now in the purchase order module. So we'll just use select line items to land. As far as the dollar amounts though, those should post through to general ledger correctly. Good question from Dale. What if there are two separate freight charges for the same purchase order? Now, are the freight charges, are they being billed separate? And if so, you can still include the total freight for that entire order on the landing freight field on the receiving transaction, and then just include just the specific freight charge for the one invoice on the invoicing line item, just like I was showing you when adding the port charges from the previous question. Then you would enter those freight charge invoices separately in the accounts payable module. All right, another question from Laura here. She's talking about the auto distribution is throwing general ledger out of balance. Yeah, Laura, that is not an issue that I'm aware of, actually. So that is something you would probably want to contact your sales rep on or the support team on. So it looks like that issue is still a work in progress. That very well could be the reason why they haven't got the automatic distribution working correctly. So, and Kathy is saying she's having the same issue. All right, that is good to know. I will make sure the support team and programming team are aware of that as well, so we can make sure that the out of balances are taken care of, because that is not supposed to happen. All right, so with that, that ends our webinar today. Looks like we did get through all the questions so far. If you have any further questions, go ahead and give us a call. Contact us at your support hotline and contact your sales rep as well. We do have some upcoming webinars coming up here in the next couple of months. I've got the schedule here. April 1st, no fooling. It's April Fool's Day, but I'll try not to fool anybody on that day. I might throw in a joke or two. Kevin's actually the comedian around here, though, not me. So, but we're going to be talking about how to set up bill of materials in the inventory module for that webinar. That's basically setting up kits is what that refers to. So be sure to tune in for that. When I say no fooling, okay, we did have a separate webinar scheduled for April 1st, which is now moved to May 6th, and it's the new features for 5.1 coming out. So that webinar is moved to May 6th. So any of you who have registered for the April 1st webinar for the new features, that's now moved to May 6th. Those of you that are registered, it's still going to be April 1st. You can still stay registered, but the topic will be setting up bill of materials, setting up kits in the inventory module. We've got a special webinar coming up on the 22nd of April. That is our month-end checks and balances. Basically how to reconcile your other modules with the general ledger and make sure everything is all balanced and in line. Your control reports is what that'll be on. And then May 6th is the new features we were just talking about. The one that was moved from April 1st is now May 6th. So any of you that registered on April 1st for the new features, you'll need to re-register for May 6th to see that webinar. If you want to stay tuned on April 1st for the bill of materials, you don't have to re-register again for that. And then June 3rd is to find the out of balance on your balance sheet. So here we go. We were talking about out of balances. Be sure to tune in on June 3rd. We'll talk about how to narrow those down and how to fix those. All right, so with that, one moment here. Okay, Joe was just pointing out to me that if you're already registered for the May webinar, let me back up here on that. Previous. If you're already registered for the May 6th webinar, this is what it's going to be now. If you're already registered for the April 1st webinar, it's going to be set up on Bill of Materials. So just keep that in mind. If you registered for April 1st expecting new features and you're not registered for May 6th, then you'll want to register for May 6th to see that one. But if you're already registered for May 6th, you're good to go. All right, give us a call if you have any questions or comments about Denali, about the webinar today. You can also email tech support. Specifically those out of balance issues, I'd recommend contacting tech support if you have any questions on that. I know that I will be contacting them as well and talking to our programming team to make sure that they're aware of that if they are not already aware. So. And with that, thank you all for joining. Be sure to tune into the website for the recorded presentation and follow-up communications, also to see a list of all of the webinars coming up. Thank you so much for joining us today, and we'll be back in a month for our next webinar. So be sure to tune in again. Have a great day, everyone.